Hello, I'm Brunhilde Biebuck, Director of Read Hall, joined by Sinead McCausland, who organized today's webinar. On behalf of Columbia Global Centers, we want to thank you for joining us. We hope this conversation will make you feel like you've escaped to Paris, even if only for an hour.
Hi, I'm Sinead. We're honored to host journalist and writer Lindsey Tramuta in conversation with staff writer for The New Yorker, Lauren Collins, to celebrate the French language publication of Lindsey's book, The New Parisian, or La Nouvelle Parisienne, published by Hedgehog Press. It's available now in both English and French in your local bookshops. We'd like to remind you that there will be a Q&A session at the end of the discussion. You can submit your questions throughout the webinar via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen.
Lindsey, Lauren, the Zoom is all yours.
Okay, well, I wanted to say thank you to Columbia Global Centers. Thank you to the American Library in Paris, which is the co-sponsor of tonight or today's event, depending on where you're sitting. And also thank you to my dear friend, Lindsey Tramuta, for asking me to talk about her book tonight and for producing this piece of work, which does so much to challenge this kind of old, dusty idea of the Parisian and to update her and to expand her and to make her something that maybe more people can relate to. Lindsey, so you've said that you wrote this book because you felt, and I quote, the city deserved better. Can you tell us a little bit about just the genesis of the project and why you felt that Paris wasn't quite Paris and the Parisian wasn't quite getting her due?
Well, so, I mean, this really is a continuation of what I started with my first book, The New Paris, which also stemmed from this feeling that Paris was so much more than everything that we've continued to be told it is. So, you live here, I live here, we see what it's like every day. We see all of the different neighborhoods and all of the changes that have emerged over the years. And that's really what we see depicted in popular culture, in media. And quite frankly, unless you follow quite religiously newspapers like the New York Times and which will get into some of these, very localized changes, you're never getting that full picture, and certainly not from film and most fiction around Paris. So, I felt like we were just sort of, as reporters, but also as other writers, we were sort of contributing to this literature about Paris that was leaving a big chunk of the story out. And so I wanted to, try to change that in the way that I could, which was to look at the ways, at least in the last 10 or so years, Paris has been changing, in not just in food, but through urban sort of planning and social policy and that sort of thing. And the second book about Parisian women really is an extension of that. If there's anything that's super obvious in the last handful of years, it's the way women are sort of universally talked about in a way that can be quite reductive. And when you take Parisian women as the sort of most fetishized and romanticized group of any foreign or non-American country, you're looking at a whole series of stereotypes that have been allowed to carry on and to be perpetuated over and over again without any real considerable challenge to those kinds of ideas. And so I felt that as a woman who lives here and who has essentially become an adult woman here and felt the pressures of this archetype that is unrealistic and very much part of a fantasy that was generated in popular culture, I felt like there was something to be done and a different story to tell.
Okay, so let's just back it up for a second and define that archetype. Tell us about the socio-historical construction of the Parisian. Who is she and who created her and why?
So I think that, in today's mind, when we think about a Parisian woman, we might think of someone who's naturally quite slim, very affluent, or at least very pulled together, fashionably minded. Certainly she's straight. We don't really ever get the sense in most mainstream depictions that she is anything but straight and able-bodied and quite frankly, very concerned with artifice. And that really goes back to an idea that started in the 18th century. I mean, we think that, these kinds of depictions maybe started with Brigitte Bardot, but it goes much, much deeper. And that was really the first iteration of sort of a myth of sorts that was going to be nurtured over time. So Rousseau, in one of his early works, really set up this idea of the Parisian woman as being very, very concerned with superficial matters and fashion and fashion as a source of status. She was big on drawing attention to herself. She was big on seduction. And because that work was so widely read across France, but also eventually across Europe, that sort of set a standard. And from there, other writers and painters would build upon that idea. Then, of course, it changed. You had also, La Garçonne much later. You had other depictions. You had, the idea of a fashionable woman, even who was from a working class background. So, it's sort of, there are differences in class, but there were some through lines that you see across various generations. And then, of course, with the Belle Époque, you also had prostitution, and you had the real element of seduction and sensuality and sexuality that was really tied to the Parisian woman. So there's like that bit, which is very focused on sort of this personality and almost like a theatrical quality to this woman. And then, of course, you have the other myth, which I think is, I would say, built on fact, which is this sort of interest in fashion as it became a part of everyday life. So you had the Bon Marché, which as a department store in Paris really can't be understated in its importance for developing this association that we all have today with Paris and fashion. And so because it was this early sort of source of style and sort of spectacle in a way, where women would come and be seen and want to see what they could sort of adopt to change their personas, that became extremely important. But also we have to keep in mind that store and that idea of being associated with fashion went on to inspire other stores that we know today, like Selfridges or Macy's in America. So, one of the big reasons it became super popular was that you had sales and you had seasonal fashions that we didn't have before, or women didn't have before. And women actually would come from outside of Paris to try to seek jobs. And that was quite rare for the time, because women were very much dependent on their husbands or other men. So they were not financially autonomous. And this was sort of a way for them to both, if you were affluent, to kind of reinvent yourself perpetually through fashion and clothing, or to emancipate yourself. And I think that's where sort of the crux of the myth really began, going to the 18th century, then building up right until the Second World War, where you had American GIs who also played a part in perpetuating some of these ideas. And I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is the way information would travel. So when you had American GIs who were based in Paris and were sort of briefed ahead of time as to what the personalities of these women that they were going to encounter were going to be like, and they were told that they were not as easy as their reputation led people to believe, and you shouldn't maybe get involved with them. That creates a certain image that then those men, who eventually would, we know, have relationships with local women, would take back with them. So all of these things get built into the sort of running narrative around Paris and around Parisian women, and it's very hard to break that. And so just to jump ahead, when you then have corporations and brands that capitalize on this idea that is so ingrained and so sort of popular insofar it's accepted without much question for so long, you have a formula that is very difficult to break.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, in our contemporary acquaintance, this Parisian with her material accoutrement is usually selling us things. Like, in the course of researching the book, you must have amassed a great collection of Parisian paraphernalia. Do you have a favorite representation or misrepresentation of the Parisian? What did you come across when you were combing through, through all the different advertisements, different descriptions? Like what was there, yeah, a Parisian
Well,
that stuck out to you? I mean, yeah.
Well, I think what's amusing is the way that even foreign women would be used to sort of step into the role of a Parisian woman. So you had Kate Moss, who over the years has represented all sorts of French fashion and perfume brands. Yves Saint Laurent, there's a famous perfume with her, and you see the Eiffel Tower behind her. So, you know, she's sort of as close as it comes to being a Parisian woman without being a Parisian. And we're supposed to know that based on her size, her, you know, her hair color, her way of life, and the sort of aura that she exudes. And I don't necessarily think that's accurate, but it's certainly what we've seen over and over again. But what I think is misrepresented is the way, you know, you have to really dig through films like Amélie, which was immensely popular, to get sort of a more quirky, bohemian, you know, not particularly traditionally beautiful woman, to really see that there is a little bit of diversity in the representations. But I mean, that's, you know, Amélie Poulain is still a white girl from the 18th arrondissement who has a pretty cushy apartment and a, you know, and a cushy life. So, but the real thing that surprised me was the extent to which foreign brands will adopt French sounding names for their products because it confers a certain status and value. So, I mean, I'm a big fan of Glossier, but Glossier is meant to sound French. You know, there are brands in hair care, in fashion, that adopt this sort of set of qualities and set of values because it thinks, you know, they think it somehow not only confers value but quality.
Right.
I just find that very, very amusing that we continue to look to France and specifically Paris as some sort of beacon of superiority in the matters of taste.
Well, and what's interesting is this dominant idea of the Parisian cuts out any number of French women who aren't Parisian kind of out of the national narrative, while presenting them to an international audience as this undifferentiated mass. I mean, Parisian has come to stand in for French women. So like, what is the difference between French and Parisian? And then maybe you can also get it. This is a double-headed question, but maybe you can also get into the difference between the French woman and the French girl, which has become,
Ooh.
So French woman versus Parisian and French woman versus French girl. What are these different archetypes?
Well, so first of all, the problem is the way that we, and you nailed it when you said that we constantly conflate Parisian. You know, the media will talk about French girl, anything, whether it's fashion or style or, you know, street cred or whatever, when really they're talking about Parisian women. And that actually has to do with the way that Paris, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, was the economic, cultural, and social epicenter of France. So at that point, when you had writers like Rousseau, who were documenting sort of the eminence of Parisian women, but also Paris as a sort of hub, you started to see that being, well, if you were anybody at the time and you were talking about being in France, you were necessarily in Paris. So that, I think, is a holdover from some very old ideas and associations of, you know, the treatment of Paris versus France. Today, I mean, I like to use this as a counterexample because they're so different. But if you were to call a woman from Marseille a Parisian girl, I mean, I think their heads would explode. I mean, truly, culturally, their values, the way they're raised. I think probably the sheer proximity to water and sun changes your behavior altogether. So
We wouldn't know.
We don't know that, but it seems logical. So you'd have to assume that, you know, when the foreign media especially likes to throw around, you know, French girl, when really they're talking about the Parisian girl, you're excluding the very nuanced and complex regional differences that exist within France. Now, when you're talking about French woman versus French girl, we love to infantilize the French woman. So part of that has to do with some of the figures that have emerged that have been very gamine. You know, the gamine was also a sort of archetype within the archetype. I mean, the girl who's meant to look forever young, and sometimes even has this sort of meek, fragile quality in the way she holds herself and the way she dresses. That I think is part of why we look at, or we still hear sometimes French girl. And I don't really know why, women's magazines in the US will refer to, when they're specifically talking about adult French women, why they insist on talking, using the headline French girl, probably for SEO reasons. I imagine that just over the years that has performed better, but it just seems like no one overall is giving much thought to the words that we use when we talk about this particular set of the population. And that's really my takeaway.
Right. Okay. So we have this woman on her vintage bike, which connotes that she doesn't use public transportation.
Right.
With her, grandmother's Chanel bag, which connotes inherited wealth. With her boyfriend shirt, which connotes boyfriend, not
That's
girlfriend.
great. Yep.
It's not that this person has never existed. You may have even seen this person in the wild once or twice. But I liked you quote Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and saying it's not that the stereotype is untrue necessarily, it's incomplete. So when you put together this roster of, it's 40 women, right?
Yeah, around 40 women. Yeah.
Yeah, of 40 women that you wanted to feature, to challenge, to expand, just to update the archetype. What were you looking for? How did you think about who you wanted to feature? How did you compile the list? How did you go about persuading people to participate?
I mean, it's funny. What you say about this archetype existing is true. I mean, and that's exactly why I wanted to talk about the single story idea, because it's not that she doesn't exist. Obviously, there are many neighborhoods in Paris where you might see her floating around. I mean, Saint-Germain-des-Prés is basically full of women who fit some variety of this set of characteristics, but she's not the norm. And that's what I was looking. I was looking for women who reflected the kind of woman I saw every day when I was taking the metro, for an hour every single day, and getting on and off. What was she reading? Where did she come from? What was she, how was she dressed? Where was she going? What is she doing? And that's the thing. We talk so much about what Parisian women look like, which is part of, the starting point of dismantling this concept. But beyond that, I did this sort of cursory check with some American friends and British friends, and said, like, what's the first sort of like profession that comes to mind when you think of a Parisian woman? And they're like, maybe she works in marketing or fashion. And I was just like, wow, it's really not that evolved, the common knee-jerk reactions people were having. And I was like, there's something wrong with this. There are, women represent more than half of the population, and we should be understanding what they're doing to contribute to society. So that was sort of one starting point. And then I started, like I think you do with these kinds of projects, with looking around me. So whether that's like in my Twitter feed or the people I know in my network who, are doing interesting things or have become known for putting forth a certain set of ideas that I think are really powerful. Of course, that led me initially to a whole bunch of activists, because they're the most vocal and the most visible. So that's where, my years of following Rokhaya Diallo and her anti-racist activism and, came into play. But there were others. And, I think this is where I like to say that all of my time on social media isn't for nothing, because I have found so many fascinating people through these tools. And as for sort of convincing them, most of them didn't take much convincing. I wanted to get a real panel of professions and backgrounds and get at the fact that this is a city that is made up of so many people from foreign lands, or who have become adopted Parisians, or they're from elsewhere in France. It might even be
the only criterion was you are a woman and you live in Paris.
Yeah,
nothing else. I mean, you could be born elsewhere. You could be. Yeah. You didn't have any rules other than people who.
No. I mean, it was.
Yeah.
No, and I mean, obviously, we have to mention the fact that this is a country that doesn't collect ethnic data. So I wasn't about to match my selection to figures. For example, there are X percent of X percent of the population is from North Africa or from Asia. That wasn't the goal, but it was a deliberate attempt to show a variety of the faces that you do see every day. And what shocks me to this day is when you meet travelers who, maybe they've never taken the RARB in from the airport when they arrive. But many first-time visitors will say that they didn't realize the extent to which Paris was so diverse. And that seems to me a failure in perhaps reporting in the media, in popular culture, to properly represent this place. So my selection was a small step in trying to challenge that.
And I mean, you have everyone from a rabbi to a boxer to Anne Hidalgo, the female mayor of Paris. So did Anne Hidalgo say yes immediately when you called her up and said, I'm doing a book about the women of Paris? Did everybody get it?
So she was probably the toughest for obvious reasons. I mean, at this point, the mayor of Paris is, about as about in high demand as the president. And so it took just months of harassing her team, essentially, because, you have gatekeepers. So it's not so much that she would have been opposed to it had I run into her on the street, but you're going through layers of her people who, have to understand. And so that one took a little bit more time. But otherwise, everyone got it. And everyone seemed to say, finally, there's clearly a body of literature that might develop that tries to get the story a little bit more correct, or at least more representative. Other than that, it was quite, scheduling wasn't even as much of an issue as I would have thought. And really, I think I came at it at the right time when people were starting to become very fed up with just overall the way that we're talking about women. And so by extension, this is like, okay, yes, of course, let's do a better job. Let's maybe start here and see how this trickles out.
Well, how does Instagram, how does social media play into this? Has it congealed the Parisian, or has it helped to complicate her? What do you see when you're scrolling through your feed, when you look around?
Well, I think part of it is it's on everyone to choose and to, for lack of a better term, curate their feed to be less monolithic. If you want to see the bicycle riding, bourgeoise from Saint-Germain, you will find her, and you will find foreigners who come and try to emulate that and take photos and put that on the internet. But there are plenty who don't do that. And I think once you start digging into the types of communities that exist on social media where like-minded people can find each other, whether that's the LGBT community, whether that's the disabled individuals within France who rally around these themes and around hashtags, which make it, much easier to find them. You see that you can really see a much broader picture of who people are, not just in Paris, but all of France. If you dig just a little bit, it doesn't even require that much effort. So I think, unfortunately, it does demand on the average, Paris lover or consumer to peel back the layers a bit more, because you will see actually that there's, a whole world out there that you can access from wherever you live.
You have a huge following on social media. I mean, what kind of feedback do you get when you try? Do people just want macaroons in the Tuileries, or what kind of response do you have when, or how do you find a balance between giving people this kind of cliched escapism that they might be looking for, and trying to represent what you feel is a just and true depiction?
Well, I think part of it is, the commentary you leave with certain images. I mean, if you're going to post the Eiffel Tower, maybe tell an interesting story in the caption, or, express something that isn't just, like heart emojis. But then I also think that that's been sort of my way of communicating from the very beginning. I never was if I'm going to show macaroons, I'm going to tell a story of, of the producer or something. So I was always trying to go a little bit further. And the only time I really met backlash to my sort of insistence on, that some stereotypes are really, really reductive and dangerous is when it came to Emily in Paris, which is when I was, some of us, maybe not all of us, but some of us were on our soapbox, not angry, but very disappointed and trying to, dissect the problems with the show in terms of representation, particularly at a moment like this. And that's when you see, of course, exacerbated by COVID, when people were desperate for escapism. But, that's when the rhetoric was, oh, come on, let us have our, rainbows and unicorns kind of thing.
Right.
But for the most part, I think that people are open, especially frequent travelers who are coming to Paris or coming to the rest of France and are looking for that something else. That might be, different types of dining, but that also might be a much more diverse set of stories about the place and about its people. So I think I'm able to sort of get myself into that.
I mean, you use the word dangerous in the book. You write that stereotype is engineered, pervasive, and deeply troublesome. Like, why do we care? Why does it matter if Emily in Paris never, never sees a single Arab person having a drink on a terrace, in the entire show? Why does it matter if the Parisian is not eating leek soup for dinner every night and wearing a little black dress? Like, why is that troublesome?
Well, for one, it's troublesome and exclusionary for the people who live here, who see that. This is a global city. We're a global world. People watch films from all over the world. So French people and Parisian people are seeing the way that they're represented in film and television over and over again. So not only are local women seeing the way they're represented at home, which is extremely problematic and insufficient, which is which I do talk about in the book quite a bit in terms of their visibility.
There's an incredible statistic in the book that 15% of people who were talked about or written about in the media in 2018 were women.
Yeah, and the number,
and within that, right.
And within that, I mean, you have also just the airtime that women get as experts on television. I mean, it's absolutely shocking. And, these are figures that are publicized. There's the CSA, which is, an audiovisual committee that looks at, controversial issues and looks at figures and this sorts of thing. It's all documented, and yet there's very little change, mostly because when you have people that don't see the need to offer a plurality of voices and faces, they're the ones making the decisions. They're the ones in the boardrooms and the directors and the, they think that you have to typecast someone from, West African origins in caricatural roles of maids and thieves. And, it's absolutely astounding how much this endures. So those kinds of representations at home are already very difficult psychologically for the local population, especially when they know that they might not even have access to the same opportunities. So for many other political reasons. So, thinking that, oh, I can't even see myself or imagine a career where I might be an actor or, a doctor who gets to go and comment on television. But then you add to that the way the foreign world looks to Paris and to its people, and you're just erased, you're invisible. And the reason that's problematic everywhere, but when you take this place, which is, the first or second most visited city in the world, and you're producing content and you're selling this city as a brand, well, its people are part of that. Whether they like it or not, they are part of that. And I think, everyone has a duty to at least do a slightly better job of selling an accurate depiction of what the city offers.
So you're not in the book, Lindsey, but I think people are probably curious. Tell us a little bit about your relationship to the Parisian or to Parisians in their multitude. When you feel like a Parisian or have felt like a Parisian, when you haven't, what kind of pressure that archetype has exerted on you as you've, grown in
Well,
Paris?
it's funny because people assume that if you've landed in Paris and you also studied French literature or French language, that somehow you were by default a Francophile, and so you came knowing everything there was to know about these ideas. But I didn't. I studied, Baudelaire and then Afro-Caribbean authors in college, and I was very interested in mastering the language. I wanted to have a perfect comprehension of everything I read, and I wanted to be able to speak like a local. Strangely, that did not really involve much exposure to sort of modern or contemporary depictions of life in France. So I did come when I was in high school, and then I came again when I was in undergrad. And that's when I started to feel like, oh, not so much in high school because it was a very sort of sheltered experience. But in college, when I came, I started to see like, even just from billboards, seeing the kinds of images over and over again. You have to keep in mind, I grew up in suburbia and then went to school in Center City, Philadelphia. And you see so many different people in Philadelphia that you sort of, I felt not necessarily invisible, but I didn't feel like I was comparing myself to anyone. It felt like we all had sort of our space to exist and go through life. And here I realized I was being bombarded by images that were, that felt sort of like I had just like woken up in an advertisement, and I was supposed to, I was going to degrade the quality of the city by not somehow matching what I'm seeing in these images. And so I put tremendous pressure on myself to try to adapt, whether that was like buying a shirt I saw that seemed to be in fashion, even if it looked terrible, even if I couldn't pull it off for whatever reason. And it was just this constant, how do I mold myself to fit this set of expectations that no one has actually communicated to me, but they don't have to explicitly communicate it because it's sort of there. It's in the air, it's in casual conversation. It's, the idea that, when I was interning at L'Oreal for a few months, a casual comment by a woman who said she skips dinner and only eats yogurt, and you're like, oh, is this real? And so
Right.
it was this, dance for a number.
You're like,
of
is that disordered eating or is that
Well, I was
France?
like, that sounds actually, that's what I thought. When I hear that, I'm like, that sounds like a lot of things I was told were not healthy. But they talk about it in such casual ways. And so, first of all, that was like, debunking everything we were told about, French women don't get fat. Okay. This veneer of superiority and perfection was starting to crumble. And I was seeing that it's all very much around product and what you can buy into. And I both didn't have much money as a student, and certainly didn't for quite a long time when I was working, to just feeling capable of or the pressure to mold myself to something. And so I didn't really feel like myself for a very long time, because I was trying to figure out who myself was within this context. And as a 20 or 21-year-old, when you move over here, that's already a very tenuous time.
Did the French-born women that you spoke to for this book tell you that they felt subject to that pressure too?
So interestingly, the women who were from the suburbs felt it as soon as they sort of crossed over the périph and were building their professional or adult lives in Paris. Others who grew up in Paris, like Rokhaya told me that she grew up in the 19th. She never questioned her identity, and it wasn't until she entered the workplace, which was obviously a more white environment, where she started to feel like, oh, I'm different. She never questioned her difference. And then some of the French-born feel most French when they go abroad, because they're not sort of burdened with questions of their origins and the judgment around, oh, you don't look like, Jean-Michel machin, where are you actually from? All that line of questioning that we know to be so common here. They sort of escape as soon as they say they're French in another country. It's sort of like they can actually just be who they want to be. So I did come across that. And then some of them, I think had just a different level of strength, or just different levels of confidence when they arrived in Paris, and, felt liberated So Muriel Talandier, who grew up in a smaller town where everyone knew everyone's business, and she couldn't really like live out her love life that as she wanted to, because she was going to be judged or everyone would know. And so in Paris, she became, a smaller fish in a big sea, and was able to, go through all the changes she was going through sexually, and, didn't feel the same pressures. So it really depends on each woman's unique sort of story or context. But I do think Paris can be liberating, just as it can be a psychological burden.
Well, so you've gone out and canvassed all these accomplished and interesting Parisians, with so many different backgrounds and so many different professions, in different family situations from different walks of life. Is there anything that unites them? Did you find a common thread? Is there something that unites them all, that they share in their difference? Just one thing that I thought was very funny and very Parisian was I did notice that a few people in the book were a little bit squirrely about sharing their bonnes adresse. When you asked, like, what's your favorite? I was like, maybe that's,
that was actually that was the hardest part. And the women who were, there was a small number of women who were, like maybe a couple who were born and raised or spent most of their lives in Paris. And they were the ones who had literally zero opinion. I was like, do you have a favorite place? Like,
right.
Really, this is
like, maybe that is what a Parisian is, a person who refuses to tell you exactly where she takes her morning coffee.
Yeah, there's a bit of discretion in that way, but otherwise it's really, they all love Paris in some way. And I think it's not, not an obnoxious way, like, oh, I love it so much. It's there's a deep affection, whether that's because of, some moment in their lives where it really, it was a place that was there for them, a safe space, or, just because they thrive creatively here or professionally, but there's always something uniting them. And even there are women who, spend a lot of their time on the road, and Paris is their home base. And despite having lived in so many different places and spending a lot of their time away, still feel this sort of magnetic pull. And I found that kind of to be, almost reassuring, that we're all part of the same little unit, and that there really is something about this place.
I loved something that one of your subjects, Ariane Bernard, said about conformity in Paris. She said she was talking about going out and trying to be an individual and achieving your goals. And she said, Paris is so strong and beautiful that she seems to say, well, yes, you're an individual, but I'm Paris. I set the rules. And I like this idea, first of all, of Paris personified as kind of a hard ass. But have you ever had to push back against Paris? Did you have to override Paris in a sense to make this book?
I think I needed to digest all of the injustices that exist here. I think that's the big transformation for me personally, was sort of becoming completely aware of every little aspect that is imperfect about this place. I mean, some of them, just by nature of living here, but, you're talking to people who are experts or heavily engaged in certain, social justice issues or, economical issues. And all of a sudden I became immersed in that world. And now I can't unsee these things, and I can't uncare, I can't stop caring about these things. And so in a way, I am both enamored by Paris and constantly frustrated by certain policies, by, certain developments that, seem completely, logical and important, that haven't emerged. And some of them, of course, involve more than just Paris. I mean, they're, nationwide. But as the capital where we tend to debate these issues very heavily, I find myself unable to disconnect. And that can be a good thing, and that can also be a bad thing. But I think that's my current fight with Paris is, there is still so much potential, live up to it, and, make this a better place for people.
So, I'm curious to know, since you published the book, I mean, you're a journalist, you're out every day meeting people, reporting, and I'm wondering if since you published the book, are there women, whether specific individual women or types or categories of women that you would love to add to the book now, if you could go back? Who else would you include? What have you learned? You know, I guess the American version was published
Why?
summer, right?
Yeah.
So if you're continuing your kind of catalog of Parisian women, what would you add now?
Well, I mean, I think one of the women I actually very much wanted to include in the beginning, but schedules didn't align, and I think her people also didn't deliver the right message. Is a stand-up comedian named Shirley Sueno, and she started the Barbès Comedy Club. But she started that sort of when I was filing the manuscript, and I just think she's phenomenal. She's taking stand-up comedy codes from the US but doing it well. And in last January, she actually had invited Jerry Seinfeld, when he was passing through, and he performed or did like a little set at her comedy club. And so I really, really would have loved to incorporate her, because not only is comedy sort of, we think of France as being, being in theater and other types of arts, but comedy, at least in a, not Gare à Mêler and, some of the other, maybe there are like a handful that non-French people would know, but, she's sort of in this like underground movement. And also her background, her persona, I've been so fascinated by her. So I would have loved to include her. Also, there's a woman I met after, everything was locked and done and I couldn't add anybody. Jacqueline Gompi, who runs Little Africa. And she's originally from Cameroon, has lived in France for years, and is really trying to develop the not only sort of travel options and tours for foreigners, but really an option to connect businesses within France with the Afro-European community and culture, and to make that more a part of, of business. And so I enjoyed meeting her so much, and we had so much in common, but unfortunately it was after the fact. And then hopefully I would love someone in pure science, someone who's doing, I don't know, virology maybe, just someone who I think is doing something so radically different from anything that I could possibly comprehend. But this could keep going forever, and there will forever be women. And that's why I think it's important that, we start with having some stories so that we look out for other stories.
Do you have any idea where your interests might take you next?
Sneaky. Yeah, I mean, I think there are other types of ideas to dismantle, whether that's about life in Europe or life away from one's home. And so I'd like to explore those. I think that, expats, I'm not an expat. I don't consider myself, I mean, you and I are both French at this point, but also we're here for the long term. We're immigrants. And I think those are distinctions that often get confused. But, we Americans specifically, when they live abroad, are often grouped, I think, into this category, at least of people who never leave, of being these privileged, folks who don't plan to integrate, who don't, necessarily offer much to local society. And I struggle with that, because I see so many people, but millions of other people, Americans especially, who have left home and who are living somewhere else, who are flourishing or contributing or growing because of the place they've chosen as their home. And so that's something I'd like to explore.
Super. I could ask you a million more questions, but I see that we have a number of questions that have come in from participants, and I want to make sure we get to a lot of them. So I'm going to start with some of those. Okay. So I'm just going to read them to you.
Sure.
Okay. Hi, Lindsey. I have a question about examples you've seen of women. This is a question from Mira. Hi, Lindsey. I have a question about examples you've seen of women supporting each other in Paris. I loved the profiles of all the women in your book and was left wondering what spaces are available to help support women across sectors, and how we create community to continue to support and empower each other.
Oh, that's a very good question. Part of the problem with communities is the French approach to what community implies. So I'll try to explain what I mean. The word communautariste, which is a word I explain in the beginning of the book, kind of conflicts with the American and perhaps even, English idea of, multiculturality and connecting with like-minded people of a group that is separate from your nationality, to do, whether it's community organizing or supporting each other or whatever. So, for example, when people say the Jewish community or the LGBT community, here it's looked at as being, well, that's an identity that you're saying is more important than your Frenchness. So I find it very difficult, aside from, sort of joining organizations and, nonprofits and things like that. I find it very difficult to join any kind of club or group in this, like those that exist, for example, in the US. You do have some things, though. My Little Paris, which is a now quite a large media organization run by women, does have a sort of female-powered offshoot, which is a club that does events and puts out content around women and what women are doing, called Mona. And they have a space. I want to say it is in the Latin Quarter, in the 15th. Where other women with businesses, and including organizations like Règles Alimentaires, which is a nonprofit that tries to support menstrual, what do we call that? Poverty. Is that what we call it? I'm having a blank, Lauren. What do we call that? Like to make support for women who need, menstrual products and support more available, that kind of thing. So it's an NGO that helps tackle that issue. And so they all share a similar space. I think it's called the Cité Radieuse. But so Mona has a physical space where they can welcome people and you can connect with other women. There are business organizations too that try to connect women. But ultimately, I think it's on individuals to do the uplifting themselves. So, I don't know that, we've seen what happened with the Wing in the US, and that looked great on paper, of women supporting women, but in fact, in practice was less than stellar. So I don't know if necessarily, organizations or clubs or things are, the only way to go. But I do think that what we're seeing, even online, again, another point about social media and finding these people who are sharing and supporting the work of other women, it's on everybody as a personal responsibility to do that.
An attendee says menstrual precarity.
Precarity. And I said poverty. Yes, precarity. That's the word.
Starts with a P, ends with a Y. You were
Here you go.
So this is a more general question, but Lindsey, what are some of your favorite books about Paris that you could recommend?
Ooh, that is such a good question. So this is not a nonfiction book. It's a novel, but that is set in Paris, and it's not a new one either. It's The Elegance of the Hedgehog. I just loved this book, probably because it was so quirky and depicted, the kind of eccentric and seemingly undervalued gardienne in a Parisian apartment, with sort of a quirky kid who comes from a more, perhaps a more affluent family, but is completely lost and depressed, and they find each other. And I think stories like that are set in Paris, I almost prefer than any of those that are sort of, on the nose about Paris. But I will say I do, I really liked a book that's not new, another one, and I think it's called Almost French. And that's not also exclusively about Paris, but deals with sort of the feeling of adapting into French culture. And I read that maybe 10, 12 years ago, and I think it still holds. And another good one is We'll Always Have Paris, which I think is actually quite funny and sharp. So yeah, I'd say 2 nonfiction and a fiction for you.
Okay, here is a 2-part question from an anonymous attendee. First of all, do you think there's a class issue in terms of what the idea of the Parisian woman defines? So I'll let you maybe take it away on that one, and then
Sure.
I'll give you the second part of the question.
Absolutely. And And you're reminded of this. I mean, Lauren, you touched on this when you mentioned that, a woman who goes everywhere on a fancy bicycle or vintage, wears vintage Chanel, communicates something about her upbringing, or her, or her status. I mean, okay, maybe she went through the bargain bin in a vintage store, but that's not the norm. I do think class is an issue. I think that you see that more, I think more obviously in representation. So obviously when you're walking down the street of Paris, I mean, whether someone feels or looks Parisian is completely dependent on, your understanding of what a Parisian is. But the way that we see Parisians depicted locally and abroad, I think you do get at the class issue, which is that we are only supposed to show women or men who are of a certain socioeconomic status. And whether that translates in people's minds, I think it must play a role. I think if you look at the way certain elite schools have maintained their reputations for, being these little petri dishes of privileged, affluent elitism, and these universities. I mean, look at where all the presidents come from. It's like a breeding ground of upper class brainiacs, and that's like a very specific world. So I do think class plays. I don't see how it couldn't basically play a role in our understanding.
Okay, the second part of the question is, say that foreigners are open to the idea of the Parisian woman evolving. Could you say that some Parisian women may feel threatened by the stereotype becoming more inclusive?
Sure. I mean, the reality is that there are white women everywhere in the world who want to protect their own set in life. They want to protect their own social class. And by involving or being more inclusive, you're effectively challenging their lot. Yeah, and also you have that when it can be a generational thing, but it's not just older women of a certain age who feel this way. Although I am reminded of Catherine Deneuve, who at the time of Me Too, decided to be on the side of women who wanted to protect men's right to bother them and to basically seduce. And she did so in a way that comes from a position of privilege. Of course, she doesn't have to take the metro every single day and get leered at or get, molested. So you have women like that of a certain class or of a certain privilege who are, of course, going to protect what they see as being, perhaps fragile. And so, yeah, people coming in and threatening that status quo could feel a bit disconcerting to some people.
Okay, David would like to know, do you think Parisians of today, Parisienne of today, are still expected to be well-read, cultivated, literary?
I do, but I don't necessarily think that's a Parisian thing. I think it's a French thing. And Lauren, you have children, I do not, but I understand that there's a certain way that the French education system operates and the way they're taught to have a general knowledge of culture that's far broader than what we, I believe, are taught in the US. They're sort of like, they should be able to talk about literature and wine and all sorts of things from a young age. And we're not really pushed in that direction as American kids, What do you think about that? Because I feel like that's still something.
I don't know about wine for the kids,
wine, but
but no, I mean, it was interesting. I asked on Twitter the other day if people had been forced or encouraged to memorize poetry at school, and if so, what lines stuck. And I think a disproportionate number of the responses were from French people. I mean, there's still a lot of rote memorization in school, but they're also, philosophy is like a pretty non-negotiable part of the, I'm not even going to, I'll get my terms wrong, but high school of the lycée curriculum. So yeah, I would say so. But again, what I like about your book, Lindsey, is the idea that it can be accurate and still incomplete. Like that you can have a lot of Parisian women who can really hold their own talking about culture, art, literature in a general way. I mean, even if that's not their wheelhouse, but that's certainly not a prerequisite for being a Parisian, and that there are plenty of Parisians out there who just watch the Kardashians all day long.
Yes, I know that. I love when you give that example because it is funny. It does exist, but we don't want to believe that because we hold the Parisian up to some sort of like ridiculous standard, like there's a throne that we're removing them from if we know that they eat McDonald's, which they do, and eat French tacos, which they do, as you've explored, and watch the Kardashians. But it's on the flip side, you hear it from French people too, who assume that because you're American, you did not grow up with culture. So, people are generalizing because it's easy.
Okay. You mentioned some of the negative sides of Paris that you encountered through some of the women you spoke with. What are some of these that we who live in Paris should be aware of, perhaps to get involved with or to otherwise be more mindful of?
Well, one of them is about just how inaccessible Paris still remains if you are even mildly disabled. It's not enough to have ramps that are, come down off the bus when there's someone who needs to board who's in a wheelchair. You need people who know how to operate them properly. I have personally been on a bus with a driver who thought that he couldn't pull over enough to allow the woman to get close from the curb onto the bus. And so he was about to drive off. And if it weren't for every passenger on the bus yelling at him, sort of telling him that there was enough room, you can't leave her there, he would have driven off and just left her to be, sort of stranded because of because of his own incompetence. And so that's something that I think I'm now extremely aware of. When I go into the metro, I realize how inaccessible it is. There are, hardly any elevators in metros, curbs, the sheer size of the sidewalks, everything that was not conceived for people who are disabled. So there's that. There's also the navigating the city as a woman, I think is part of sort of the urban landscape that needs to be considered. Obviously, in some neighborhoods, it is very well lit and it is very sort of easy to identify markers and where police are or where help might be. But you go to other areas where clearly the city does not provide as much funding, and the street lamps that may have light bulbs blown are not fixed, or you get a sense that there are just not the same considerations made equally across Paris. Those are two, but I mean there are plenty. I mean, with regard to that NGO, the Menstrual Precarity Association I was telling you about, I mean that really is meant to help not just refugee women or migrant women, but also underprivileged women within Paris and the greater region who are struggling. Students who can't afford to eat in Paris because of COVID or because of other reasons, they've lost jobs. That's obviously a very specific issue now, but all of these things are sort of symptoms of living in an expensive urban environment, and there are ways to get involved and help.
This is from Tatiana. Thank you, Lindsey. Enjoyed the book and enjoy following you both on social media. I'm curious as to hearing your thoughts on French Parisian society's acceptance of women of Asian and or Latina heritage.
Well, the idea of acceptance, I think, you nail a kind of issue, which is that we're still talking about whether they're accepted as part of local society. There not as recently as what's going on in the US, but there has been a spate of it's probably early on in the pandemic, maybe even there was a spate of anti-Asian, attacks in different parts of Paris, and there's certainly a lot of racism and discrimination that exist. So I can't. I mean, obviously, I'm not of Asian or descent, so I can't really speak to their experience. But it does seem that overall, when you are slightly othered, you may go through life in this city, like in other places, being treated differently. And that's a problem. That's one of the key injustices that I think a lot of the women in the book are trying to fight against.
Okay, I'm going to read a comment from Aisha on that note because I think it just adds to our discussion. She says, more of a comment, that Paris has been widely different from how it's portrayed for way more than 10 years. I was born and raised in Paris, and as a Black woman, I have never seen myself represented in media. Black people are often absent altogether or shown as hoodlums from some shady suburbs.
Mhm.
I grew up in Paris with people of all races, all highly educated, and I still don't see us represented. I'm a French woman, and yet people from abroad are always surprised to hear it. Even French people question my Frenchness. To go back further in history, both my grandfathers from Mali fought for France in both World War I and II. Where are they in the war movies, the men from former French colonies who were sent to the front lines? Where are they in the representation of Frenchness?
I mean, that's exactly it. And the problem is that as soon as you start bringing up these issues, particularly in the media, or you're someone who's very vocal and visible, like Rokhaya, who, is one of, sadly, very few of these, very visible thinkers today who are going against, what are obvious injustices in the way society operates, is she's met with all this, resistance that, but this is the past. Why you have to try to change everything. But the reality is that the telling of the past is not always accurate or representative, just like Aisha is saying about war films not showing all of the people who fought for France. And that was, it's Charles de Gaulle himself, when he when Paris was liberated. I mean, he intentionally didn't want any of the African fighters who helped free France essentially to be honored or recognized. So this is clearly a huge problem, and that is exactly what the U.S. is by no means perfect, but I think there is a real intention behind trying to correct some of these issues. It's imperfect, I know, but France is not even doing half of that work. And there's a lot of resistance to. I mean, look at how Macron won't even discuss, any kind of formal apology or reparations for France's role in the Algerian War. The only time he mentioned a sort of apology on behalf of France was during his campaign, but he hasn't made any such statement since he's been president. I mean, what kind of message does that send?
I think we are over. I don't think we have any more time. Thank you all so much for being with us for this hour, and make sure to get Lindsey's book because it really is extraordinary. So yeah, thank you everyone. I think that's it for this evening. And Lindsey, it's been a pleasure.
Lauren, thank you for doing this. Thank you, Columbia, and Columbia's global centers for hosting us. And if you read French, you can now find the book, obviously, in France, and even in New York, at Albertine, the bookstore, they will have it. It's findable. And I want to shout out to the 3 other women who worked really hard on this book. The photographer, Joanne Pye, who's also from Paris, lives in Paris. Agathe Singer, who's the illustrator, whose work you'll discover. And then in the French version, Karine Degliam O'Keefe, who did an incredible work adapting this text into French. I couldn't have obviously done this work without her.
Okay, I think that's it.